A young woman was cruelly humiliated and thrown out of a lavish party simply because of her skin color. But when they found out who her grandfather was, fear took over and everyone's legs began to tremble. The muffled sound of glasses clashing, the laughter of refined voices echoing through the hall, and the soft music creating an air of opulence made Maria feel out of place from the first moment. The golden lights reflected off the expensive jewelry and luxurious dresses that floated around her and Lisa, her 10-year-old daughter. It was as if the glitter around them was an invisible barrier, separating them from those people. For Maria, the invitation to the Williams party should never have happened. Not because she didn't want to be there, of course not, but because deep down she knew they weren't welcome. She couldn't refuse the invitation, not after years of working as a maid in that house. Sarah Williams, her employer's wife, made it clear with her forced smile that the two of them were there purely as a formality. The kind of formality that keeps up appearances, nothing more. Maria tried to disguise the tension in her chest, holding her head high and clinging to the idea that Lisa, so innocent and hopeful, could perhaps enjoy herself that evening. After all, she was only a child. Lisa, in her simple dress, looked around, enchanted by the bright lights and the grandeur of the mansion. The fascination in the girl's eyes made Maria feel a knot in her stomach. She knew this enchantment wouldn't last long. Things were never simple for them, not when it came to entering spaces where, however much they were present, they weren't really accepted. She watched her daughter's every move, hoping that Lisa would remain on the sidelines, invisible, without attracting attention. But children are curious, and Lisa, with her pure heart, believed she could be friends with anyone. Then it happened. A group of children were playing near the large fountain in the garden, laughing loudly and running around. Lisa, smiling shyly, approached, hoping to be included in the fun. Maria watched from afar, tightening her grip around her handbag. She felt in the depths of her soul that this moment was about to collapse. It was quick and cruel. One of the boys, Ben, the host's son, suddenly stopped and looked Lisa up and down. That cold look, loaded with contempt, was the harbinger of something bad. "What are you doing here?" Ben snapped, his voice cutting through the air with a venom disguised as childish naivety. Lisa's world froze. The joy that had once filled her eyes vanished like smoke, giving way to a painful emptiness. She looked around confused, searching for some sign of acceptance, but only found Ben's incisive gaze, which undressed her with its contempt. "You're not like us," he continued, casting a disdainful glance at Lisa's simple dress. "Go back where you belong." Those words, laden with a cold and merciless rejection, resounded like a sentence. Maria, watching the scene, felt the ground open up beneath her feet. Her mother's heart beat faster, each beat bringing a wave of humiliation and pain. The shame of seeing her daughter treated like that was a crushing weight. Lisa took a step back, her eyes beginning to fill with tears. She didn't understand. She couldn't understand why she was being treated like this. All she wanted was to make friends, to play like the other children. But there, in that world where a person's worth was measured by appearance and wealth, there was no room for girls like her. Maria felt her body move before she even realized it. Her legs trembled as she crossed the garden towards her daughter. Her breathing was heavy, not only from the effort of crossing that sea of judgmental stares, but also from the avalanche of emotions that took her inside. She couldn't allow this to continue, not with her daughter. Reaching Lisa's side, Maria pulled her close, slipping her arm around the girl's shoulders as if to protect her from the invisible poison that hung in the air. But it was too late. The wound had already been inflicted. And worst of all, it had only just begun. Maria pulled Lisa close, trying to distance her from those cruel words, but the damage had already been done. She could feel her daughter's body trembling slightly. It was as if the girl was shrinking away from the world, trying to hide from the shame and humiliation that was falling on her like a storm. But before Maria could even console her daughter, a sudden silence overtook the place. Sarah Williams, with her ever-rehearsed smile and icy gaze, approached with firm steps. Her shiny dress seemed a stark contrast to what was about to happen. "What's going on here?" Her voice cut through the air, carrying a forced calm that made Maria's hair stand on end. Maria felt her blood rise. She could see the look on Sarah's face, the look that left no doubt that, for her, this was a minor inconvenience, a minor setback in her perfect evening. Without bothering to listen, Sarah had already passed judgment. For her, Maria and Lisa were the problem. Your daughter is... Sarah hesitated, searching for the right words, but there was no need. The tone she used, that venom masked in false cordiality, said it all. She's bothering the others. And then, without even blinking, she added with an almost rehearsed coldness, this party isn't for people like her. At that moment, Maria felt as if the world had stopped spinning. People like her? The phrase echoed in her head, repeating itself, crueler with every turn. The humiliation burned inside, but what devastated her was seeing the pain on her daughter's face, who remained motionless, eyes fixed on the ground, as if trying to disappear. Maria took a deep breath, searching for strength. She tried to speak, but the words got stuck in her throat. She couldn't scream, not in that place, not at that moment when her daughter needed protection more than an outburst of anger. But how could she bear it? How could she accept being treated like that, as if they were invisible, as if their presence there was an affront? What do you mean, people like her? Maria forced out the words, her voice shaky but full of dignity. Sarah raised an eyebrow, surprised at Maria's audacity to challenge her publicly. But before she could reply, something even worse happened. John Williams, the family patriarch, appeared, attracted by the small commotion that was now forming. His eyes swept the scene, showing no surprise. It was as if he had already decided the outcome before he even knew the details. If you're going to cause trouble, I ask you to leave. John's sentence came without emotion, without a trace of consideration. It was an order, simple and direct. Those words sounded like a verdict. Maria looked around, feeling all the stares now weighing down on her and Lisa. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the place. Every face there was full of judgment, and no one, not even for a second, seemed to question the injustice of the situation. No matter what Maria said, there was nothing that could change that moment. They were already doomed. Lisa held her mother's hand tightly, her small trembling hand seeking some consolation, some security amidst that sea of contempt. Maria felt her heart squeeze. All she wanted was to protect her daughter, but at that moment it seemed as if the whole world was against them. She wanted to scream, she wanted to tell everyone how unfair it was, but she knew that would only make it worse. With her face burning with shame, Maria started walking towards the exit, holding Lisa by the hand. Each step felt like an eternity, as if the ground was opening up beneath her feet. The whispered conversations around them were like invisible stabs. But the worst thing of all, it was the certainty that, in that world, Maria and her daughter would never be more than people like them. Maria had barely taken 2 steps towards the exit when she heard again that cold voice that was already becoming a curse that night. John Williams, ever the master of the situation, held up his hand, stopping them in their tracks. I'm not joking, Maria, he said, with that calm that only the powerful have when they know they're in control. If you don't want to cause any more trouble, you'd better leave now. It was like a punch in the gut. Those words, spoken in front of everyone, weren't just an order. They were a public humiliation. John didn't need to raise his voice or show anger. His authoritative and indifferent tone did the dirty work. For him, Maria and Lisa were a nuisance that needed to be removed discreetly without further disrupting the party of the rich and well-born. Maria wasn't a real guest. She was just someone he had tolerated, and now no more. Maria felt the guests' eyes on her like sharp blades. Each one of them seemed to be waiting for the next step, eager to see the spectacle that was becoming more and more shameful unfold. And the cruelest thing? Nobody did anything. Nobody moved to defend them. They were all accomplices in that deafening silence, watching as if it were a theater scene put on, especially for them. For these people, Maria and her daughter were invisible, except when it was convenient to ridicule them. Lisa, still holding her mother's hand, seemed frozen. The little girl didn't understand why this was happening. All she wanted to do was play with the other children, but now she was there, in the middle of that humiliating stage, exposed and vulnerable. The pain in Lisa's eyes was almost unbearable for Maria, and at the same time, She found herself with no way out. If she left, it would be like confirming everything John had said. If she stayed, she knew the situation would only get worse. What do you do when your own pride and the need to protect your daughter collide so brutally? She wanted to say something, anything that could break the unbearable tension. She wanted to defend her daughter, to stand up to John and everyone else, to say how unfair it was. But how? In what world would Maria, a domestic worker, have the strength to change what was happening there? The weight of inequality crushed any reaction, and deep down she knew that the only thing left to do was to accept defeat and walk away with what little dignity remained. She took a deep breath, trying to gather what courage she had left. Lisa looked at her with those big eyes full of questions that had no answers. "Mom, why?" Maria felt the weight of that voiceless question. How could she explain to her daughter that, in the world they lived in, it wasn't enough to be a good person or to have a pure heart? Sometimes, just being who they were was enough to be rejected. Before she could take another step, the hall was filled with an even deeper silence. Something had changed. All eyes were no longer on her and Lisa, but on the front door. A man of imposing presence had just entered. His perfectly tailored dark suit, his firm posture, and that air of someone who doesn't need to ask for respect, but demands it, caught everyone's attention. Maria couldn't believe her eyes. Robert, Lisa's grandfather, was there. He never attended this kind of event. He didn't like to show up at parties. He didn't like to mingle. But there he was, as if fate had brought the only ally Maria and Lisa could have on that dark night. The whole room stopped, and Maria, for the first time that night, felt a thread of hope. The air in the room changed the instant Robert entered. It was as if time had stopped, and all those people, who minutes before had been ready to see Maria and Lisa humiliated, now shrank into silence, as if they had been caught in the act of a crime. No one there expected him to be there. Robert was a respected name, feared, and in some circles, almost legendary. The sound of his leather shoes echoed as he walked calmly toward the center of the hall, eyes following him as if he were a general inspecting his troops. His eyes, however, were fixed on just one thing: Maria and Lisa, who at that moment seemed small in the face of all that opulence and contempt. Maria didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted to run to him and ask for help, but another part, the prudent hurt part, hesitated. She didn't want to appear weak. She didn't want her daughter to see her like this. But then she looked at Lisa, holding on tightly to her hand, the girl's eyes still watering, and she understood that sometimes you had to accept help, even when your pride insisted on telling you otherwise. Robert finally stopped in front of them. He looked at Maria with a firmness that was almost reassuring. Without saying a word, he turned to face John Williams, who, for the first time that evening, looked a little less confident. John knew who was in front of him. Robert was more than just a guest or an influential businessman. He was the man who, behind the curtains, moved the pieces of that world to which John tried so hard to belong. The silence in the room was so dense that it seemed almost palpable. People looked from one to the other, trying to understand what was going on, but no one dared to interrupt. Robert looked at John, and at that moment, the man who had previously seemed to be in control of the situation was now pale, nervous. Sarah, next to her husband, kept her fake smile, but you could see the tension in her eyes. She, who minutes before had been so cold and cruel, was now just a shadow of her former self. "What's going on here?" Robert's voice cut through the air like a blade, deep and authoritative, but without raising his tone. He didn't need to shout. The weight of his words was enough. John tried to answer, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. He opened his mouth once, twice, but nothing coherent came out. Sarah, on the other hand, saw an opportunity to try and save what was left of her dignity. "They were causing a problem with the children," said Sarah, her voice wavering, but still trying to hold her pose. Robert looked at Lisa, his eyes softening at the sight of the girl still red-eyed from holding back tears. He looked back at Sarah and John, and the change in their expression was immediate. It was as if a veil of coldness had descended over him. "This child," said Robert, his voice now with a gravity that made even the most distant guest shudder, "is my granddaughter." The impact of those words swept through the hall like a bolt of lightning. It was as if thunder had broken the silence. No one moved. No one dared say a word. John and Sarah exchanged desperate glances, trying to understand what this meant for them. Panic was clear in both their eyes. They had humiliated Robert's granddaughter. Their mistake wasn't just a social gaffe. It was a complete disaster. John took a step forward, trying to pull himself together, but his legs were shaking. He was pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. "Robert, I didn't know," John began, his voice breaking as he desperately tried to justify himself. "If I'd known she was your granddaughter—" "Ah, so if I had known it would have been different?" Robert's voice rose sharply. "Do you have to know who she is to treat her with dignity?" John stammered, but couldn't answer. There was no excuse for what he had done. Silence overtook the place again, and now everyone knew that all that remained was the outcome of the disaster. Robert was not the kind of man who forgave easily, and everyone present knew it. John Williams stood there motionless as the weight of Robert's words crushed any attempt at an apology. The room, which minutes before had been the scene of laughter and small talk, now looked like the scene of an impending disaster. Everyone was completely silent, watching the scene with a mixture of horror and morbid curiosity. They knew that something serious was about to happen, but no one dared to intervene. John's face was pale, his eyes turned away from Robert, who continued to stare at him with that cold, steely gaze, the kind of gaze that makes anyone feel insignificant. He knew that his power, which used to be unquestionable in that mansion, was crumbling in front of everyone, and what was worse, his wife Sarah could see it too. She, always so calculating and controlled, now kept her head down, her lips pressed together, as if the mere fact of breathing was dangerous. Maria, next to Lisa, still felt her daughter's hand pressed against hers, but something inside her was changing. The shame that had consumed her earlier was now being replaced by something stronger: dignity. For the first time that night, she felt that the power the Williams had over her was dissipating. Robert's presence, with his firmness and authority, was a reminder that she and Lisa were not alone, and that the humiliations they had suffered would not go unpunished. Robert broke the silence. "I think we should have a talk, John," he said with frightening calm. "Now." Those words felt like a sentence. John looked around, searching for support in the gazes of the guests, but all he found was the uncomfortable silence of someone who doesn't want to get involved. They knew he was about to fall, but no one was willing to stand between him and Robert. It was a power game far beyond their comprehension. The people who had once been willing to flatter him now pretended not to know him, turning their faces away as if they were witnessing something too shameful to watch up close. With heavy, hesitant steps, John walked into one of the private rooms, following Robert, who didn't say another word. Sarah stayed behind, motionless, not knowing what to do. For the first time in years, she wasn't in control of the situation, and that scared her more than anything. She looked at Maria with a glint of anger in her eyes, as if she still couldn't accept that all this public humiliation had originated with her and her daughter. When Robert and John disappeared into the hall, the room began to breathe again, but the tension was still palpable. People began to murmur amongst themselves, exchanging looks of shock. No one dared to say out loud what everyone already knew. John had humiliated the wrong person, and the punishment for this had only just begun. Maria watched everything closely, without taking her eyes off the door through which Robert and John had left. She knew that the conversation that would take place in there would define her daughter's future. Whatever Robert said to John would change everything. Lisa, still confused, looked at her mother. She didn't fully understand what was going on, but she knew that something had changed. Those people who had previously laughed and whispered about them were now quiet, and the atmosphere, which had previously felt like a prison, was beginning to seem less oppressive. Maria, noticing the look on her daughter's face, bent down and whispered, with more confidence than she felt, "Everything is fine now." But was it? Maria knew that things were far from over. John's frightened look, Sarah's pale expression, all indicated that a storm was brewing. They had gotten themselves into something much bigger than they had expected, and the price would be high. Inside the room, the confrontation between Robert and John had already begun. The walls muffled the words, but everyone knew that John was fighting for his position, his influence, and who knows, his future. Outside, the guests exchanged more nervous glances. They knew that the evening had changed dramatically. What was supposed to be a lavish celebration was turning into a bitter lesson about power and consequences. And across the hall, as Maria held Lisa's hand, a sense of justice began to take shape. Perhaps for the first time, they were being seen, and that in itself was a victory. John left the private room with a visibly shaken face. He could barely hold his head up as he crossed the hall, where the guests were still murmuring, intrigued about what had been discussed in there. For someone used to being feared and respected, this was a painful blow. Robert had said little, but his words carried the weight of a lifetime of influence and power, and John knew that the public humiliation of that night would not soon be forgotten. The control he had always believed he had was crumbling before his eyes, and he needed to act. As he reached Sarah's side, the discomfort in her expression turned to something darker. He could feel the Diski's contempt in the gazes around him. The realization that he was losing his prestige, his position, was eating him up inside. Sarah, still trying to remain dignified, whispered between her teeth, "We're not going to let this get away with it, John. He's going to pay for this." John looked at her quickly, the gears in his mind already starting to turn. He knew that his wife, as haughty as she was, had a point. Robert, Maria, Lisa, they would all need to feel the impact of that night, but he had to be careful. An impulsive response wasn't enough. He needed something bigger, something that would regain control and, above all, the position that was now slipping through his fingers. Later that evening, while the guests were leaving, John and Sarah were at home, each lost in their own thoughts. The mansion, which had always seemed to be the symbol of their authority, was now more like a prison. John felt the weight of that night on his shoulders, and anger boiled over in silence. He knew that in order to restore his name, he would have to bring Robert down, but taking him down wouldn't be easy. Robert had connections, power, and an influence that went far beyond what anyone in their social circle could imagine. It was Sarah who brought up the idea that would change the course of the situation. She was sitting at the table, a glass of wine in her hand, staring at John. "If you want to regain control, you need to find something against him," she said bluntly. "Robert is not untouchable. Everyone has skeletons in their closet, and if we can expose his, he'll never have that power over us again." Sarah's suggestion struck John like a spark. He was silent for a moment, pondering, but then his eyes lit up with an idea. If there was anything in Robert's past that could be used against him, John was going to find it, no matter how much time or money it cost. He knew that Robert, with all his impeccable posture, had probably made dubious choices in the past, deals that couldn't see the light of day, and that was where he would start. "I'm going to hire someone to dig into his past," said John, his voice low, almost as if he were talking to himself. "I need something, anything that will make him think twice before stepping on our doorstep again." Sarah smiled, pleased. She knew that John was ruthless when it came to protecting what was theirs, and if there was one thing Sarah understood well, it was the power of fear. If they could find something to make Robert tremble, everything could go back to normal. Their name would be safe, and that feeling of helplessness that had set in since the party would disappear. Without wasting any time, John called one of his more discreet contacts, a private investigator, someone who specialized in dealing with the dirty affairs of high society, would be exactly what they needed. They wanted someone who could find any detail, no matter how small, that could be exploited. John knew it was a risky game, but at that moment, the risk seemed worth it. Over the next few days, the investigation into Robert's past began. His every move was being analyzed, every document from years ago reviewed, in search of anything that could compromise his image. Meanwhile, John and Sarah kept up appearances, attending social events, but always with the dark plan hanging over their heads. They waited patiently for the investigator to return, confident that, somewhere, Robert had made a mistake that they could use against him. And then, a few weeks later, the investigator finally called. John answered the phone, his anxiety disguised by the calm voice he always used in crisis situations. The man on the other end of the line spoke quickly, describing what he had found: small, suspicious financial transactions, long-standing associations with people who, at the very least, would arouse suspicion. It wasn't recent, but it was enough to plant doubt, and in the world they lived in, a well-placed doubt could be deadly. "That'll work," John said, a grim smile appearing on his lips. He turned to Sarah, who was looking at him expectantly. "We have what we need. Robert won't see it coming." While John plotted his revenge, Maria was far from imagining what was going on behind the scenes. She was concentrating on something much bigger for herself and her daughter, the foundation she was creating. For Maria, it wasn't just a response to what had happened at the party. It was a way of fighting against everything that night symbolized: prejudice, humiliation, exclusion. She knew that there were many other people like her and Lisa, invisible in the eyes of the powerful, and she was determined to give them a voice. The idea for the foundation was born out of that pain, but also out of an urgent need for change. Maria wanted more than just to survive in a world that treated her with indifference. She wanted to fight so that other mothers and children wouldn't have to go through what she and Lisa had gone through. Deep down, Maria knew that this fight would be long and full of obstacles, but for the first time, she had allies. She spent weeks meeting with potential sponsors, telling her story, explaining the foundation's mission. Every time she talked about the fateful night at the Williams mansion, she felt the shame and humiliation come flooding back. But she turned this pain into fuel. Every look of support she received, every handshake that said, "We're with you," made her feel that she was on the right track. Of course, there were those who looked down on her, who thought it was impossible that someone like her could make a difference. But Maria was used to being underestimated. She remembered how Lisa's expression had changed over time, from an embarrassed girl who couldn't understand why she had been treated like that, to a girl who now accompanied her to meetings, listening attentively, absorbing every word Maria said. Lisa understood that this was more than just her mother's project. It was a fight for justice, for equality, and she wanted to be part of it. There was a strength growing inside Lisa, and Maria was immensely proud to see her daughter finding her own voice. Even so, Maria knew that not everyone was on her side. She noticed the sidelong glances, the hushed comments at some of the meetings. The people she met were powerful, used to seeing foundations as a charity accessory, something to feed the ego. But for Maria, it was much more, and she made that clear with every word she said. She knew that John and Sarah wouldn't simply accept her success. After all, people like them didn't like to lose, and the way they had been exposed that night still haunted them. Maria was preparing for a battle, not by choice, but because she knew that the road to gaining respect and equality would not be easy. What she didn't know, however, was how far John was willing to go to destroy everything she was building. The phone call she received one afternoon was the first sign that something was about to happen. It was an anonymous call, short and to the point. The voice on the other end was disguised, but the warning was clear. John was up to something. "Be careful," said the voice before abruptly hanging up. Maria felt the floor disappear for a moment. She knew that John was a powerful man, and any attempt by him to attack her could have devastating consequences, not only for her, but for the foundation and all the people who were beginning to depend on it. Without wasting any time, Maria called Robert. He had always known that John would not accept defeat, but even he seemed surprised by the intensity of this new threat. Robert, with his experience, suggested that they prepare for the worst. "If he comes after us, we have to be ready," he said, his voice carrying a seriousness that Maria had never heard before. He also knew how the power game worked, and that John didn't play fair. Over the next few days, Maria and Robert worked tirelessly to strengthen the foundation, reviewing all the documents, preparing for any attempt to tarnish its reputation. She knew she had to be transparent, to present everything impeccably. If John wanted to attack her, he wouldn't find any loopholes. And so, with Robert's support and the strength that was growing inside her, Maria continued her mission, determined not to let John's hatred destroy what she was building. But the blow was coming, and Maria, no matter how much she prepared herself, didn't know the gravity of what was to come. John's blow came quickly and without mercy. On a gray morning, newspapers and gossip sites began to pop up with explosive headlines. Allegations that Maria, in her foundation, was embezzling funds for her own benefit, that she was manipulating donations and misusing the money. To an outsider who didn't know the real story, it seemed like a perfect scandal. Maria was at the foundation's headquarters when she saw the first news. Her heart sank, and for a moment, the world stopped. The faces of her employees and collaborators, which had once reflected confidence and hope, were now marked by fear and doubt. She knew it was John's doing. He had finally made his move, and there was no doubt that he had played it hard. As Maria tried to process what was happening, the phone calls began. Sponsors who had previously been enthusiastic began to hesitate, canceling appointments or asking for more details about the allegations. The support that had been built up with so much effort began to crumble like a house of cards. Maria knew she had to act fast, but inside she felt a fear she hadn't felt since the fateful night at the Williams party. She called Robert. He wasn't surprised by the news, but his usual calm was absent. Robert knew how serious it was. "We need to get ahead of this," he said firmly. "If we wait, John will destroy everything." That same afternoon, Maria and Robert called a press conference. It was the only way to stop the lies before they spread further. Maria knew she had to be clear, transparent, and above all, firm. She couldn't let the false accusations destroy her. As she entered the room full of journalists, the cameras flashed nonstop, capturing every step, every expression. Maria took a deep breath and positioned herself in front of the microphone. The room was full, but the weight of the moment made it seem as if she was alone. For a brief second, all she felt was silence, the echo of her own breathing. And then she began to speak. With a firm voice, but without hiding her emotion, Maria explained everything. She opened up the foundation's finances, presented every document, every transaction, proving that none of it was true. The figures were there. The transparency was undeniable. She didn't need to defend herself with empty words. The facts spoke for themselves. Throughout the press conference, Maria looked at the cameras, at the journalists, but above all at those who wanted to see her fail. To John, who wasn't there, but certainly watched every moment. This foundation was created not just by me, but by all the people who believe in a fairer future. And I'm not going to let destructive lies take us away from that, Maria declared, her eyes shining with the intensity of someone who had suffered, but wouldn't give up. The press conference was a success. The press, which had previously fed off the scandal, now had to acknowledge the truth. The headlines changed. They now talked about Maria's transparency, about her strength in facing the accusations with dignity. Sponsors began to return, some apologizing for having doubted. But Maria knew that the battle was not completely won. John, on the other hand, was far from celebrating. As Maria regained control of the situation, he faced a very different reality. Investigations began to turn against him. Those little suspicious transactions he had found in Robert's past. Now the authorities were looking into John's accounts, and what they discovered was a tangle of financial irregularities. He had spent so long trying to destroy Maria that he had left his own weaknesses exposed. That night, when the police knocked on the door of the Williams mansion, John and Sarah were sitting at the table, still believing that their plan would work. When the officers entered, their gazes met, and at that moment, they knew that the end had come. John was arrested for fraud and conspiracy, and Sarah, complicit in all his actions, was not far behind. Meanwhile, Maria and Lisa, after weeks of uncertainty and fear, could finally breathe. It wasn't easy. They faced doubtful looks, mistrust, and even hatred, but they came out stronger. Maria's foundation, which had almost been destroyed by lies, was now flourishing more than ever. And Lisa, who had been hurt that night at the party, now walked beside her mother with her head held high, knowing that they had overcome something that could have broken them. In the end, John and Sarah were the ones who fell. Maria, who began this journey full of invisible scars, had turned her pain into strength, and the world, which had so often ignored her, now saw her with new eyes.